So today's session is the last session of the lecture portion of this seminar. We're going to end with a session on anthropology. And I'm guessing most of the people in this seminar are people who haven't been trained in anthropology. I actually have also not been trained in anthropology, but I have a couple of advantages. One is that I'm married to somebody who got a PhD in anthropology. So that's counts for something. But the other thing is that I have found certain anthropological writers and thinkers very useful even for the multi-species work. So I'm going to try to give you overview of how to use anthropology, at least for our purposes. This is very much not an introduction to anthropology. I am not qualified to be that person, right? So why anthropology? Why bring anthropology, as the name suggests, is the study of human beings and human cultures. So what does that have to do with multi-species existence of any kind? It's a very basic question. It's a fair question, one that I would like to address, right? There are a few obvious reasons. So the first two reasons in this slide are, I would say, the obvious reasons, right? Which is most communities outside of, say, most, let's say, non-urban communities live with non-human species. If you're an agrarian community or a forest community, indigenous communities for sure, you are intimately in contact with non-human species all the time, right? And as a result, they often have deep knowledge of the natural world, at least in their ecological context. Engaging with community knowledge is one of the things that anthropology has done. And by studying what's called, say, ethnobotany or ethnozoology, like the way that different communities experience the natural world around them, we may get perspectives which we otherwise won't get. So those two are the obvious reasons to think about multi-species work and anthropology in the same breath. The third, which is actually, I think, the great theoretical contribution of anthropology, is that anthropology is actually a theorization of difference. If you go back to the second reading that we had, which is quite a difficult one, I will admit it, one by Manuel de Landa, the idea of assemblages, the idea of difference, the idea that there are distinct ways of being in the world is something that anthropology studies really well, right? So it's a study of culture not through unification, but of differentiation. And to say that there are fundamentally different perspectives is one of the things that anthropology, I think, does quite well. And it's something that we can learn because, say, contrasted with ecology, the natural sciences have a pretty strong bias in terms of unification and you could say the eraser of difference. But anthropology doesn't try to erase difference. And I think that's a good point of view to keep in mind because different species do have different points of view on even on a shared reality, even if there is such a thing as a shared reality. Right? So that's the framing of why anthropology has a lot of value. Okay. So what I'm going to do is to give some overview of at least multi-species anthropology as gathered from three different anthropologists, all of whom I find interesting and valuable. Sorry. The first is, and the quote from the first person is a Brazilian anthropologist named Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, who known for inaugurating something called the ontological turn in anthropology, but brings really subtle and careful analysis of Amerindian belief structures, right? And so that's the first person. The second is Eduardo Cohn, who has a spectacular book called How Forests Think. And then the third is Radhika Govindarajan, whose excerpt from whose book was the reading for this week. Let's start with Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, who says, and this is from a book called reluctant native, if I remember right. Anthropologist is a person whose discourse concerns the discourse of a native, right? And in some sense, anthropology starts with the distinction between the anthropologist and the native. Um, you could say that, as he says, the native need not be overly savage, traditionalist, nor indeed native to the place where the anthropologist finds him. The anthropologist, on his part, need not be excessively civilized, modernist, or even foreign to the people his discourse concerns. The discourses in question, and particularly that of the native, are not necessarily texts, but rather may include all types of meaning, right? And so, a couple of key points here. One is there is an anthropologist and there's a native. There are some power structures, some kind of differences between the anthropologist and the native, but we don't necessarily need to emphasize those. But it's the last line that is worth spending a little bit of time on, which is, the discourses in question are not necessarily texts, but may include all types of meaning. If you aren't trained in a certain kind of humanities language, you may just read this in a bare way. But the term discourse is actually a very powerful theoretical term in many humanities subjects. And the idea is a discourse is a way of making meaning, right, or destabilizing meaning. In, say, history or in the humanities, broadly speaking, the standard form of discourse is through text, right? But what Eduardo Viveros de Castro says is that anthropologists study the meaning making from not just texts, but for other forms of discourses. Again, this issue of meaning and the fact that different cultures make meaning in different ways is something important. If we go back to what we did last week with Uxquil and cognition, think about it this way that non human species are also meaning making species. In some ways, we should be able to transplant the anthropologist native relationship to perhaps a human non human relationship. So then Castro goes on to say what is essential, however, is that the discourse of the anthropologist or the observer establishes a certain relation with that of the native or the observed. This relation is one of meaning, or when the anthropologist's discourse aspires to be scientific, a relation of knowledge. By this token, anthropological knowledge is also a social relation, since it is the effect of the relationships that reciprocally constitute the knowing subject on the one hand and the subject he comes to know on the other. As with all relations, this form of knowledge brings about a transformation in the relational constitution of the anthropologist and the native alike, right? Um, uh, Probably difficult to grasp when reading, and especially if you're not exposed to this kind of writing. What he's trying to say is that if you think of the anthropologist as the observer and the native as the observed, there is a certain relationship of meaning making that the anthropologist is tasked to do, right? Which is that the anthropologist is trying to, through this reciprocal relationship between the observer, the anthropologist, and the observed, the native, make meaning of the native's world, right? But that, of course, brings a transformation both in the anthropologist and the native. Okay. And you can imagine that this is something that we can, again, use across species boundaries. That there is a way for a non human species to be the observed and and a special kind of observer, right? As opposed to, say, an ecologist who might look at behavior, a so far not existing discipline might be one in which the observer tries to make meaning of the non-human's world, which is what Uxkul was doing. Okay. The meta relation between anthropologist and native is not one of identity. The anthropologist always says and therefore does something different than what the native says or does, even when he intends to do nothing more than repeat the native's discourse in a textual form, or when he tries to establish a dialogue, a dubious notion, with the native. This difference is nothing other than the knowledge effect created by the anthropologist's discourse, which is produced by the relation between the meaning of this discourse and meaning of that of the native. Right? There is always difference, um, and anthropology doesn't try to erase that difference. Right? Uh, and the fact is that even when you have a reciprocal relationship, what you do with the product of that relationship. And the anthropologist, of course, has a very special product in mind, some so-called field notebook or a diary that's transported somewhere else and is made meaning somewhere else. In the anthropologist, when in some sense the anthropologist's job is to domesticate the um, recordings from the conversations with the native and then turn it into their own cultural form. So this is something that is always going to create a layer of difference. Clearly, this kind of discursive alterity is grounded in an assumption of similarity. The anthropologist and the native are of the same species and share in its condition. They're both human, and each of them is positioned in their respective culture, which could even be the same. But this is where the game starts to get interesting, right? And so there is a sense that despite the difference, there is, because we are both of the same species, we have the capacity to make sense of the meaning world of the native. That's a basic idea behind anthropology, right? That it's possible for me as an anthropologist to enter into your world as the native and make some sense of it. Maybe not the same sense that you make of it, but make some sense of it, right? So, what if we were to take these anthropological methods and apply them to other species? In a sense, if that can be done well, it's a fundamental addition to the ecological method, right? Because it is really focusing on the meaning making aspects of non human beings and not just their behavioral or material aspects. Huxley, in some sense, was an anthropologist of the non human. Okay, if we are indeed to make the sense of other species, what is the situation or what is the primary form in which that encounter might lie? And this is where Edward and how Forrest think it gives us a little bit of a clue. Um, so Cohn, at the beginning of his book, says he's in Ecuador. So he's saying, settling down to sleep under a hunting camp's thatched lean-to in the foothills of the Sumaco volcano, Juanica warned me, sleep face up. If a jaguar comes, he will see you can look back at him and he won't bother you. If you sleep face down, he'll think you're Aicha, prey, literally meat in Quechua, and he'll attack. If Juanica was saying, a jaguar sees you as a being capable of looking back, a self like himself, a you, he will leave you alone. But if he should come to see you as prey and it, you may well become dead meat. So forget about the anecdote and its truth conditions, but focus on the kind of situation that allows you as a human being and a jaguar to see each other as predator in this particular case, that they are both predators, but that more importantly, you are both subjects. And so Cohn says how other kinds of beings see us matters. That other kinds of beings see us changes things. If jaguars also represent us in ways that can matter vitally to us, then anthropology cannot limit itself just to exploring how people from different societies might happen to represent them as doing so. Such encounters with other kinds of beings force us to recognize the fact that seeing, representing, and perhaps knowing, even thinking, are not exclusively human affairs, right? Let's start with the last line. Seeing, representing, and perhaps knowing, even thinking, are not exclusively human affairs. Our perspective on the world as human beings, which you could say is constituted by our sensory capacities and our cognitive capacities. So seeing, representing, and perhaps knowing, even thinking. This is the way we grasp the world. And if it's not unique to humans, if jaguars can also do things like that, they can also see and represent, know, and think about the world, and that they can see us as fellow knowers and thinkers, that is a very different way to conduct, to relate to the non-human world, right? So that's the basic idea here. Okay. That jaguars represent the world does not mean that they necessarily do so as we do. And this too changes our understanding of the human. In that realm, beyond the human, processes such as representation that we once thought we understood so well, that once seemed so familiar, suddenly begin to appear strange. So as not to become meat, we must return the jaguar's gaze. But in this encounter, we do not remain unchanged. We become something new, a new kind of we, perhaps, aligned somehow with that predator who regards us as a predator and not, fortunately, as dead meat, right? And so that mutual recognition across a species boundary, the fact that we both make meaning of each other and yet our meanings are not the same, is the starting point of this multi-species anthropological exercise. And it's a very important point. Cohn doesn't say this, but in other writing, Eduardo Viveros de Castro talks about, so he says that this is multi-world anthropology rather than multi-view anthropology, right? The typical way of even crossing a species boundary might be that we say that both a dog and a human being or a jaguar and a human being see the same world but see it differently, right? That my senses make the world seem one way to me. The jaguar senses makes the jaguar see represent the world in their own way, but we both share the same reality. Okay. Eduardo Castro talks about Amerindian beliefs where it's exactly the opposite. In some sense, what he's saying is that so there are tribes that say that both the jaguar and the human actually see the same, which is to say that in the human world, humans are humans, jaguars are jaguars, and we both occupy the same space. In the jaguars world, jaguars are human, we are jaguars, and their meat is whatever it is, and the blood is beer. So it's as if we both live in the same reality, but our realities are not the same in some sense. And so this very kind of twist of the usual claim that we are seeing different views of the same reality are contested by anthropologists who might say, what if there are different realities of which there is the same view? Okay. These are the kind of things that I think anthropology helps us at least free our usual metaphors of how the world works. Okay. So our world and the world of the jaguar meet in that act of mutual representation and recognition. That is, in some sense, the founding belief or the founding relationship in multi-species, you could say cognitive anthropology, which is that the starting point is that we can both see each other and we can both see each other in an act of recognition. So moving on to Govindrajan, because we do, now that we see each other and we recognize each other, and therefore, then the question arises, how do we then theorize our entanglement with each other? The fact that we are both trapped in the same, in this finite existence of ours. Okay. So what does it mean to live a life that is knotted with other lives, for better or worse? How do such knots come to be tied? In this book, I'm interested in exploring how these knots of connection produce a sense of relatedness between human and non-human animals. I use the concept of relatedness to capture the myriad ways in which the potential and outcome of a life always and already unfolds in relation to that of another. To take these entanglements as constituting forms of relatedness is to acknowledge, and then she goes on to see other things. But basically, what she's saying is how building on top of Kohn, who starts with that act of mutual recognition right here, through that recognition, you also may arrive at the fact that we are related to one another, right? That we, in fact, through our mutual acts of recognition, we make each other's worlds, right? That our entanglements constitute forms of relatedness. Constitution is an important thing here, right? Which is that the way in which we make meaning, that the world makes sense to us, is constituted by others. It's not something that is through just individual capacities to know and see and represent, but it's in a relational um, entanglement that we figure out how to make meaning of the world. Okay. So then Govindrajan goes on to say, she, Radha, knows something bad has happened. So this is a woman, an older woman, and Radha is a cow. And the older woman is talking about why is it that she is staying in this unprotected house with a cow instead of being in a safer location with a relative or a friend, right? So she's saying that she, Radha, knows something bad has happened. Every evening, I give the animals some grass, but that night I stayed elsewhere. So this is after a torrential rainstorm, which has collapsed one wall in her house, right? And then she had to leave, but she knew that something bad had happened. So that night I stayed elsewhere. So Jeevan, her neighbor, gave them grass instead. So instead of her, the animals were fed by Jeevan. I was so sad. It was the first time that I had not fed the animals myself. I thought, why did this happen to me? I cried. The next morning, Jeevan told me Radha had cried all night. So the calf had cried all night. When I went to the goat, I saw that she hadn't touched the grass. Usually she eats her mother's share as well. It's been 2 days, she hasn't eaten anything. Now, if I try to go anywhere, she makes such a racket that I have to come back. Mahinder, the Jharnewala, uh, says that someone may have cast the evil eye on her, but I don't think so. She doesn't even give milk yet. She's sad, dukhi, because of what has happened. She knows that I'm anxious, parishan, and she also becomes anxious. Such is Momaya. How can I let her die while I stay elsewhere for my own comfort? I will stay here. So, what if my family is not here? These animals are my family too. So, it's this very deep emotional entanglement with non human beings that is being revealed here. And whether it's a jaguar and the mutual recognition as predator, not prey, or with Radha and the recognition of interdependence, anthropology gives us clues on how our beings are entangled with other beings. Perhaps what it is to be in the famous Cartesian ergo sum, to I think, therefore I am. So that is one way, one claim about what it is to be a human being is to be a thinker. And it is that our being is constituted by the fact of thinking. What anthropology and these excerpts might be telling us is that it's not our thinking that gives rise to who we are, but our interdependence with other beings, other human beings, and other non human beings, right? So perhaps what it is to be is itself about being with others, not just sociality, which is true. We are social beings, at least human beings are social creatures, but there might be an even more primordial recognition of interdependence, of the fact that we are thrown into the world with other creatures, and that this entanglement with others is as much through emotion, through fear and love, right, as it is with cognitive capacities. So, how can we bring this sensibility into ecology? And how can we bring this ecological sensibility into anthropology? This is really the claim that the multi-species studio would want to address. And so I want to end with, again, a couple of quotes from Schleicher that we discussed a while ago in the first, or no, maybe the second session, right? He talks about synthetic philosophy. where he says synthetic philosophy, which shares kinship with what was once known as natural philosophy or later philosophy of nature, is made possible and a response to the intellectual division of labor within and among the scientific disciplines. It requires skills that are orthogonal to the increasing specialization within the increasingly esoteric sciences. It is thus a modern phenomenon of the last 2 centuries. Okay, so uh, again, if we want ecology and anthropology to deeply inform each other, can philosophy be the bridge? Right? And so then Schleicher goes on to say, by synthetic philosophy, a style of philosophy that brings together insights, knowledge, and arguments from the special sciences with the aim to offer a coherent account of complex systems and connect these to a wider cultural philosophical projects, right? So think of ecology and anthropology and cognition as special sciences. But what we want is something, some glue that brings all of them together in understanding a complex system like a multi-species city. Right? So synthetic philosophy requires a general theory such as game theory or information theory, and perhaps Bayes' theorem that is thin and flexible enough to be applied in different special sciences, but rich enough that when applied, it allows for connection to be developed among them. Right? So his claim is that you have a theory in the middle that connects all the different disciplines. What we are hoping is that instead of a theory, we have an artifact, a kind of a made up city, Shaktival, which is the thing that connects all of them. Okay, so that's the mandate of the studio. So, how can a creative artifact, Shaktival, serve as the glue that brings anthropology, ecology, and cognition together? What role does philosophy have to play in this synthesis? That's really the question I want to end my presentation with. I'm going to stop sharing. And Sataj, if you have any questions, any comments, or anybody else for that
Yeah.
matter.
Yeah. So we'll just wait for anybody in the audience to ask any questions. In the meanwhile, so please, if you have any questions, just put them in the chat box. So my question, Rajesh, is that you said that an anthropology like this can give you clues as to how we can relate to the non-human organisms better, right?
Mhm.
But I would argue that it is like in the case study that Radha Rangarajan's book talks about, where she talks of
Mhm.
this lady who will not leave the cow alone. I would
Mhm.
say it is living like the lady which gives you clues to relating to non-human beings rather than the anthropologist's take on it.
I
My
won't
argument
necessarily disagree. I won't
my
necessarily
argument
disagree.
being that, like the way I ended with the ecology lecture, that the only way to bring about this relatedness or this awareness is to live it.
Okay, so let's see if I can. Is relational, embodied, or cerebral? Uh, Presumably, it can be both. And maybe what Sartaj is saying is that the woman, the older woman, has an embodied relationality, while maybe the anthropologist has a more cerebral one. I guess we have to ask what is the value that abstraction and what we now call scientific reasoning methodologies, what do they give us? And therefore, uh, one value, especially in the Anthropocene that we all inhabit now, is the the old lady's point of view is absolutely essential, but it is also hyper contextual. And so, if we want accounts that can travel between situations and locations, we need theoretical frameworks. And that's what I'm saying will come from marrying anthropology, ecology, cognitive science, all of these together. It may be that we do it really badly, right? And if it is divorced from the embeddedness or the experiential awareness that somebody on the ground has, then yes, it'll have all those problems. But I think there is something. I mean, in some ways, modernity has created the problem, and it needs to find ways to solve the problem. And I'm also concerned about that end of the equation.
Yeah.
But point well taken. In fact, I might even say you should be able to see it from the point of view of Radha, the cow, too. That it's not just the old lady, but being able to take the perspective of the non human participant in that relationship might also be an important thing to do. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I feel like the old lady can do that, but an anthropologist might find it hard to do that.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
There's a comment from Ranjit.
That is actually is precisely the point some of these Amerindian communities have. That other species have their own. They have a theory of their world, which includes humans as objects that they study. Right? What exactly that feels? That's the kind of exercise that we may want to do in a multi-species studio, right? Which is, can we, for example, in some genuine way, study how dogs see the human world that they inhabit, or not just see, smell, and hear, right? That, in a sense, a kind of multi-species anthropology might be a kind of hybrid scientist studying dogs, studying human beings.
Yeah. One way of to begin with, I think if you just look at what cues an animal is using to get at something, like what cues does a dog use to know that you're coming home?
Mm,
Or what cues do vultures use when they look for carcasses? Is I think one way of starting that, like the first step towards that.
absolutely. I know since I live with a dog, I know all the cues that she uses to differentiate her family from non-family, right? She knows. So it's often very subtle sounds. And I have to say that one of the delights of my life has been to learn to therefore also notice those cues myself, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's what all good naturalists do. Like you start
Yeah,
looking for the cues that the animals are using,
yeah.
and I think that's the way into their worlds.
I think I have unfortunately gone well beyond my time thing. So maybe we can shift to Amshuman and yeah. Yeah. But thank you
Okay,
for all the
I'll
questions. And if there are any things that are not addressed, I can maybe use the chat window to respond while Anshuman is talking.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And just as I begin to share screen, there's like predictably a lot of overlaps between what I will present and Rajesh has just presented. So, yeah, I think this will go in some interesting directions, hopefully. Yeah, the approach I've taken is similar also to the previous presentation where I have small little excerpts, paragraphs from different readings. I'll keep revisiting the chapter that was by Govindarajan that we shared earlier this week, and I'll like speak about themes which are central in the chapter. It says the first cluster of ideas that I wanted to talk about is relatedness, which is a big conceptual sort of fulcrum on which she understands a lot of her encounters in Kumaon. So she says, my approach to relatedness is firmly grounded in Kumaoni villagers' conviction that kin making is a multi-species affair. When people said that they were related to animals, the metaphors of kinship were grounded in what they saw as truth. For them to be formed as a person was to be formed relationally with other animal persons. And yeah, this is, of course, I think this will be familiar to many of us that pets are the most obvious example, but even we might think of animals we encounter less frequently as he's in the neighborhood, he's part of the family, that kind of feeling. And just like how Rajesh had presented about the jaguar and how it seems to like the part that I just spoke about is our orientation to the animal. But I'll read out this quote and then I'll speak. Eduardo Cohen says, our lives depend on our abilities to believe in and act on the provisional guesses we make about the motivation of other selves. It would be impossible for the Runa, the community in Ecuador that he's living with, to hunt successfully or to engage in any other kind of interaction within this ecology of selves without establishing some sort of set of assumptions about the agencies of the myriad beings that inhabit the forest. This was best captured by the jaguar example that Rajesh spoke about. And again, this I'll revisit this idea again when I talk about anthropocentrism versus anthropodenial. But I think it's just illuminating to this seems like an obvious statement, but it's something that we really seem to skim over that just this idea that it would be impossible for them to carry on with their affairs without having some idea of their jaguar will act this way. And said at that level, it seems quite simplistic, but like how Rajesh and Sartaj are discussing, if we take it to the level of abstraction, it's actually quite a profound thing. And yeah, other thing that Govindrajan says is that the relatedness that I explore in this book is decidedly uninnocent. To be related to another is to be imbricated in their making, even when one is indifferent to or disgusted by or hostile to them. Mutuality and connection do not imply an erasure of difference or hierarchy. Yeah, I'll continue. This is the very next, so I'll just continue here. As Janet Carsten points out, ideas about mutuality and care tend to dominate studies of relatedness that, on the whole, give off a warm, fuzzy glow rather than a cold shiver. This focus on the positive aspects of relatedness, she argues, obfuscates how kinship is shaped by and enables differentiation, hierarchy, exclusion, and abuse. So there are a few things here. One, of course, Carsten is speaking about it very much from the perspective of human kinship, I should say. But it really and about how patriarchy, its family is not, when we speak about it, often tends to give off this warm, fuzzy glow, like she says. But there's obviously a lot of things which end up getting swept under the rug, which are defined by this sort of exclusion and hierarchy. But applied in this context, I wanted to also speak about some personal experience of the work that I have been doing at Socrates. So when I started my engagement, I was focused on a project studying urban ecologies, and it was mostly centered around street dogs and human and dog relations. And I was obviously very clear that these little cuddly creatures, obviously they have a place in our cities, and obviously we should do everything to make it hospitable to them, and within reason, obviously, that not everybody likes dogs, but it was quite categorical in my head. And then about close to a year ago, I started a fresh piece of work in Bhitarkanika in Odisha, where the saltwater crocodile reigns supreme. And that experience, in the beginning at least, it really filled me with a kind of dread, really, that how can I bring the mental models that I had used to conceptualize the work with dogs to this beastly, monstrous creature. And I think this idea kinship being more than just the positive aspects comes in, because in my interactions with people in Bhitarkanika, this really does come across that often when I've asked that, aren't you scared that you live in such close proximity to these crocodiles? The answer I get is quite matter of fact, that they just as we get hungry, they get hungry too, which is quite a like a adopting a familiar tone to how they index that relationship. So yeah, this is the saltwater crocodile. And I wanted to also speak about a writer named Val Plumwood, who's an Australian philosopher. And she was attacked by a crocodile. She didn't die due to that. She died recently, like I think a natural death. But she actually used that encounter, and yeah, and that essay it's actually unfinished because she died while writing it, but it's compiled under the title of called The Eye of the Crocodile. So she takes it to some interesting places. She says the eye of the crocodile, the giant estuarine crocodile of northern Australia, is golden flecked, reptilian, and beautiful. It has three eyelids. It appraises you coolly, it seems, as if seldom impressed, as one who knows your measure. But it can also light up with an unexpectedly intense glint if you manage to engage its interest. And then she speaks about as soon as she saw this glint, that was the provocation for it to attack. But then she continues later on saying, Since then, after the attack, since then, I have come to understand that the eye of the crocodile, along with the voice of the prey of the crocodile, and one cannot be understood without the other, is also a position to speak from, to think from. It is one I have found illuminating in building a philosophy that can celebrate the world in which we live with joy and understand our current relationship to the biosphere. So, this was actually a longer passage which I have not reproduced in full here, but she speaks about coming to terms with the idea of being prey in a very real sense. Like how we know that there are carnivorous animals that eat humans, but coming face to face with this reality is, yeah, she yeah, I would just recommend that people check out this piece. But yeah, she that's what she talks about. This is an abrupt jump in the way I've presented it here. But the next idea I wanted to talk about is how can we, so in the discussion we were speaking about what it would take to understand the position of Radha, of the cow, Radha's cow, of the three actors, basically the anthropologist, the human taking care of the cow, and the cow. So this is a peek in that direction, not much more than that. So the authors of this paper, Ethoethnology and Ethnoethology, they write, we defend the idea that ethoethnology and ethnoethology should be combined into a new science at the interface between human and animal sciences. This new field would study the hybrid communities comprised of humans and animals sharing meaning, interests, and affects, and would try to account for the complexity of interspecific sociabilities. The study cannot be reduced either to an ethology devoted strictly to animal behaviors or to an ethnology concerned exclusively with the lives of humans in society. So, continuing along this line, there's an interesting piece by this primatologist named Franz de Waal, and he writes about what I had flagged earlier about anthropomorphism and anthropodenial. A lot of the debates around human animal studies and the critiques especially, they decry what is called anthropomorphism, which, as the name suggests, is like about giving ascribing human qualities to non-human beings. But he defends the idea, and he says he gives various examples of the different things that chimpanzees can do, which I think he gives the idea, the example of there was a 6-year-old child in the Netherlands who fell into the pit from in a zoo, and the chimpanzee, she took care of him, and she took him to safety and all. In the aftermath of that, a lot of people were saying that this was just a sort of mechanomorphic, she was motivated by some instrumental reason to do this, and not that she cared for the human. In the context of all that, she says, we must be very careful not to exaggerate the uniqueness of our species. The ancients apparently never gave much thought to this practice, the opposite of anthropomorphism, and so we lack a word for it. I will call it anthropodenial, a blindness to the human-like characteristics of other animals or the animal-like characteristics of ourselves. Another contrast to this I found was in this book called Indifference by Naisargi. She's an anthropologist, Canadian Indian anthropologist, I think, and she writes really beautifully. And she, in the introduction to her book, she writes about the work of this Martinician poet named Eduardo Glissant. Glissant, he talks about the perils of ethnographic curiosity and this destructive will to know about everything. And he juxtaposes that with what he calls the right to opacity. So he says this is Glissant, the right to opacity would be the real foundation of relation in freedom. Indifference is not, as Glissant says, for opacity, the antithesis of relationality or the antithesis to relations of care. In fact, it is among the central beliefs of this book that care is born first of indifference out of respect for the opaque thatness of the object other. So I really relate to this perspective that there are things which I don't think that we can claim to step into the shoes so fully of any other being, human or otherwise. But that doesn't meaningful care for the situation and the people. And yeah, this is another, the idea of alterity and the ontological term. is something again that Rajesh spoke about in some detail. I think my take on it is slightly different. That this is again from Govindrajan's chapter. She says, uh, as David Graeber points out, most people whom anthropologists study would disagree with the proposition that they live in a fundamentally different reality or nature. Few Pahari villagers see themselves as proponents of a unique metaphysic or as inhabiting a radically different world than other humans. On the contrary, I argue, their main preoccupation is to live well as a modern subject in partial, overlapping, and sometimes incoherent worlds that they must share with other humans, non humans, and institutions. So, yeah, this is again a critique of, for example, our study in sociology, our master's course in sociology. The early 20th century anthropologists would have, they really peddled this stuff about the native conception and how the native is just radically, they live in a different world to ours and that kind of rhetoric. So yeah, this is against and again, to pick up on what Rajesh was saying about assemblages. So I think what is much more useful is to, if we recall from what Delanda says about assemblages, he calls it a concept with norms. So I found that actually a useful thumb rule to understand what he's saying, that it's not radical alterity, it's not like completely different worlds, it's more like knobs, different areas of emphasis. Yeah, I can go into this in more detail if there are questions about it. But yeah, like the desert doesn't become the city on a line, right? It there's a gradient. I use that example because it's there in the literature, and yeah, there's some interesting stuff about that. Yeah, this last part of my presentation is again problematizing the idea of difference, which Rajesh also identified as a central and unique contribution of anthropology to this field. This a lot of this could also come under the heading of political ecology. Chandra Guha, he writes in a, I've not provided the citation here, but this is a paper from EPW publication from the early 90s, but it's almost as relevant today, although there are improvements. He says Indian environmental debate is an argument in cities about what is happening in the countryside. And Amita Bhaviskar also writes about this really well, and she talks about bourgeois environmentalism. So the idea that people sitting in city centers and really comfortable, cozy offices feel empowered to speak about matters which are so removed from their reality. Yeah. So I also wanted to, in this same vein, speak about debates around forest fires, because a lot in law now, there is forest fires are considered illegal. But in many parts of the country, the authors of this paper, Notes from the Other Side of the Forest Fire, they work in the BR Hills of Karnataka. And their interlocutors in the BR Hills, they tell them about how traditionally they used to use fire as a way of managing the forest. And now this has become, since it's become illegal, the there's so many problems that they cannot tread on the forest as they used to. They are more vulnerable to negative encounters with wildlife. And lantana, of course, is growing more and more rampant, and they're not able to control it in any way. And even in my interactions with people in Bhitarkanika, it's a similar affair where people used to, there was sustainable use of mangrove wood for timber in the traditional system of forest management. But the forest department now, with the current conservation, the protected area conservation paradigm, this sort of traditional knowledge is really just done away with. And the last thing on in this slide that I also wanted to bring up is, at the same time, we should not think of the idea of these. This is again related to the idea about natives and essentializing of people in broad brush strokes. So it's not the case that forest dwellers are automatically ecologically virtuous savages. And ethnographic research entails getting into really the complexity of how different stakeholders within any particular community can hold conflicting attitudes and views about things. So this is actually from her book called In the Belly of the River, and she speaks about the efforts by different stakeholders, including large-scale landowners and peasants and Adivasi communities against the Sardar Sarovar Dam project. Yeah, it's basically underlining the need for not thinking of things in this very binary development versus resistance binary, because there are obviously people at each point in the spectrum. Yeah, this is actually a lot of the same stuff. I just wanted to put these keywords down, but I feel like I feel like this is a natural end of the flow. But again, it's nothing too different. I would recommend this book by Mahesh Rangarajan called Fencing the Forest. It's a environmental history of colonial foresting and how it's led to this current protected area paradigm. Yeah, I'll stop sharing now. Oh, there's another slide. Sorry. Yeah, this I just added it at the end because I couldn't think of a better conclusion. So yeah, the task of the anthropologist then I think is just to do as is written here. That to put this in a more concise way, another anthropologist that I really enjoy his work, his name is Lawrence Cohen. So he says that the ground of anthropology today is not society or culture at large; it's the situation. So I think that's what we should all aspire for. This is a variation on that.
Thanks, Anshuman. Couple of quick points. So you mentioned how you shouldn't essentialize difference, right? And I guess the philosophical point here is to essentialize difference is to fall back into essentialist thinking, while the real kind of deep philosophical point is to let difference stay as difference, right? And not to essentialize it as some radical difference, but to have a much lighter touch to it, which also allows you to then reassemble it, disassemble it, do all of those kind of things, right? Uh, by the way, I am thanked in Naisargi Dave's book. You should.
Yeah, that's exactly what I meant also. That difference can, yeah, I don't think I can put it better than that, but that's what I was saying.
Taj, any thoughts from you? Anything from the audience?
Yeah, we'll wait for things from the audience. So just a quick point that I had. So you started by saying that we'll never know what the other, what anybody else's worldview is, but especially what a non-human's meaning making is, right? So the example I often think of is like, how does a dog judge a car's movement when it is crossing the road? Is it looking at the driver, or does it think of the car as an independent entity? Is it looking at the headlights, or is it looking at the driver, basically? And I guess we'll never know, but yeah, we can somehow figure out design that lets dogs cross roads anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. On the dog thing, I guess one way to test it out would be if they bark at the self-driven cars.
No, as in I'm sure it's different for individual dogs as well. And because I remember this really nice anecdote of when this old lady who lives in Nepal, when she first, as a young girl, saw a bus come to her village, everybody brought fodder because they thought this large animal must be hungry. And so, yeah, it changed over the next few times that she saw a bus. But yeah.
Wow. Apparently, in the first ever motion picture, it was a train and it was like on a big screen. And people really thought the train was coming at them. So
Yeah,
we're not that far along either.
Okay. I guess if there's nothing else, thank you everyone and see you in a couple of weeks. Bye.